Hey everybody, I'm James Canal with Root Financial Partners, and I'm here to teach you what you need to know to create a secure retirement. Now, when people are planning for their retirement, they have no idea sometimes how much their expenses are going to be in retirement. And not just that, they have no idea how much those expenses will increase over time. And when you're uncertain about expenses and you're uncertain about what that will look like over the course of retirement, it creates a lot of anxiety and this sense of being overwhelmed by what that might look like for you. So what we're going to do today is we're going to understand empirically and looking at the numbers, how much do people actually spend in retirement and how much do those expenses actually increase over time. Because when you know your expenses and you know how they increase, it allows you to put a plan in place to go into retirement with much more confidence and peace of mind. Most people, when they're planning their retirement, they come up with some number. They want to know how much am I going to spend in retirement, so they create that retirement budget. And then what they do is they typically just inflate that number over time by inflation. Maybe 3%, maybe 2.5%, whatever it might be. But what we've seen in looking at the data is that might not be the best way to do it. So today we're going to look at two major findings that a study had when examining what retirees actually spend. So we're going to see those two components, and really those two components of that study have four major implications when it comes to retirees and what they can expect to spend. So a few years ago, in 2014, David Blanchett wrote an article, and it was called Exploring the Retirement Consumption Puzzle. And in that study, he did a very empirical study, or he used empirical evidence to show what actually happens when people retire, what happens to their expenses over time. Now, of course, everyone's going to spend different amounts in retirement. Everyone has different goals, everyone has different things they want to do, but in general and on average, those expenses tend to follow a similar pattern over time. So what he did in this article is he looked at something called the Consumer Expenditure Survey, the CEX, and that survey provides information on the buying habits of American consumers. Now, what happened is that study or that survey, it started to group spending by different ages. Looked at everyone from age 25 to 85 and said, how do people in these categories spend their money? And the spending was grouped in categories like clothing, charitable contributions, food, entertainment, healthcare, housing, insurance, transportation, and then other, which is just a mixture of everything else. Here's why that's important. As we're looking at those different expenses, things like healthcare versus food versus clothing versus insurance, they don't all go up at the same rate of inflation. All of those things increase at different rates historically. So if I'm looking at a 25-year-old and a mix of goods and services that a 25-year-old might purchase, it's a very different mix of goods and services than an 85-year-old might purchase. One thing that sticks out is there's probably more healthcare expenses for an 85-year-old than a 25-year-old. Well, why does that matter? Well, if healthcare costs tend to rise faster than the rate of inflation of everything else, and if an 85-year-old is spending more money on healthcare than a 25-year-old, it follows that the inflation rate of a retiree or an older person's living expenses is probably going to be much higher than that of a 25-year-old. So this had some pretty profound implications, where medical expenses, they tended to represent, according to the study, approximately 10% of total expenditures for a 65-year-old household. So all the expenses that a 65-year-old household may have, about 10% on average, came down to medical expenses. But those numbers increased to 20% by age 85. So again, why does that matter? Well, a couple things to consider. This quote comes right from the study concerning inflation. It says, given the higher weight of medical expenses for retirees, and the fact that medical expenses have historically increased at a rate faster than inflation, and are generally projected to continue doing so, it is likely that retiree expenses will increase at a rate that is faster than inflation. So as we're looking at retirement planning, the takeaway from this is to use just a simple inflation rate might be drastically underestimating the inflation of retiree expenses over the course of time. As you look at this, there's actually when you measure inflation, you're using something called CPI, the Consumer Price Index. And there's the CPI-E, there's the CPI-W, the CPI-U, and they just stand for what's the inflation rate for different segments of the population. Well, CPI-E, E standing for elderly, it is a more appropriate version for many retirees over the course of their lifetime. So what's the inflation rate for people who are retired? And it tends to increase more than inflation. So that's the first major takeaway from the study, is that as we're looking at expenses, it's maybe not practical, it's maybe not even safe to assume a rate of inflation that we use for the nation as a whole, that we use for consumers as a whole, when retiree inflation might actually be much higher. Now, before that scares anyone too much of saying, oh my gosh, inflation is much higher, what does that mean for my expenses? The second part of the study actually showed something that countered this a little bit. The second part of the study examined expenditures. So not only do we want to look at what's inflation doing, but we want to know how does the average retiree expenditure change over time. So as we're looking at ages 65 to 85, going back to the study, expenditures tended to drop. Now, what we have is a combination of two different forces. We have inflation that's going up faster than the average rate of inflation, but we have expenditures that are dropping over time. And this makes sense. Let's say you retire at 65. Well, most people retire at 65, they have their energy, they have their health, they have the financial wherewithal. They want to be traveling. They've been working their whole life and they're excited to go to Europe. They're excited to go to Hawaii. They're excited to go do all these things that they just didn't have the time to do previously. Now, that typically lasts for a few years, but people aren't usually retiring, or they're not usually traveling the same way at 75 that they were at 65. They're certainly not traveling the same way at 85 that they were at 65. So things like travel, things that are involved with a more active lifestyle and being out and about and doing more things, those expenditures just naturally tend to fall over time. So the competing forces that we have is higher inflation, but lesser spending over time. Michael Stein, the author of a book called The Prosperous Retirement, he first popularized this concept. He talked about it in terms of a three-phase retirement. He called it the go-go years, the slow-go years, and the no-go years. In terms of in the go-go years, you're out and about and you have your health and you have everything and you're just doing everything life has to offer. The slow-go years, you're still living a great life, but you've just slowed it down a little bit. The pace is a little slower. You've gotten a lot of the things you wanted to do on your bucket list crossed off, and it's now a more slow-moving pace. And then the no-go years, those are just the years, the latter end of our lives, where maybe because of health issues or because of other issues, we aren't able to be as mobile. We aren't able to do as much. So whereas younger retirees are better able to travel and enjoy retirement, older retirees aren't able to do that quite as much. Now, here's the thing. Expenditures tend to fall for retirees over time until they stop falling. And they actually tend to increase again on the latter end because yes, travel is gone, but now there tends to be more in healthcare expenses. As we mentioned, for the average 65-year-old, 10% of that budget can be attributed to medical costs. Health insurance premiums, out-of-pocket costs, deductibles, 10% is the average. For an 85-year-old, 20% is the average. So it's clear that healthcare costs have risen because there are more healthcare events that must be funded. Here's the good news. When you counterbalance those different forces, higher inflation, but expenses that decline over time, what you tend to see is the declining expenses offset the extra inflation. So even as inflation is rising over time, total costs, total real costs, so adjusted for inflation, tend to fall throughout retirement and then tend to slightly rise on the back end, but never really get fully back to where they started year one of retirement for the average retiree. So what you end up having is something called the retirement spending smile, where it almost goes like this. It's not just a fixed increase over time. You have declining expenses that rise over time, but maybe never fully get back to complete a full smile. Now, what are the takeaways from this? This seems simple enough, but there's actually some really profound implications and takeaways. Number one, it may be that many retirement planning tools are modeling or overestimating the cost of retirement. If we assume a fixed level of expenditures and assume that that increases over time, that might be over projecting the actual true cost of retirement. Now, there's some safety in that it's giving you margin over time because your retirement may not be average, everyone's retirement may not be average, but it may be overestimating the actual cost of retirement. Number two, the second takeaway, is rather than looking at retirement expenses as one big expense, can we bifurcate that in some ways? Can we separate the expenses that we will have forever? We're always going to have food costs. We're always going to have to pay utilities. We're always going to have to do certain things. Can we understand what that costs? But can we separate the expenses like travel? So that as we're planning, we're not planning for one big expense. We're saying, here's the expenses that we'll always have. Here's the travel expenses that maybe we'll have for the first 10 to 15 years. Here's the other expenses that we'll have for the first few years. Maybe it's helping children or grandchildren or funding college. And as you start to separate those, you can plan for a truer, more accurate picture of retirement, knowing that some of those expenses will fall off over time. Number three, can we have a plan in place for medical expenses? Now, this is one of the places that's most uncertain because we don't know what medical costs will look like for any individual retiree. But if your financial plan allows, can you get the best Medicare coverage? That's going to cost a little bit more out of pocket, but it's going to limit the catastrophic coverage, or it's going to limit the max out-of-pocket expenses that you might be on the hook for if there is an extreme medical event. Do you potentially get a long-term care insurance policy, or do you self-insure for long-term care insurance to protect against some of those really significant expenses that might exist above and beyond just the core living expenses? So the more we can individualize, the more we can bifurcate and look at expenses on a one-by-one basis, the better we can inflate those numbers or add in or take out those numbers as we're planning for retirement. And then number 4, and probably the most important factor, is retirement spending patterns are an important component on deciding a sustainable spending rate. So when we are looking at how much can you sustainably spend on your portfolio, is it 4%, is it 5%, is it 5.5%? All those assumptions are based on the fact that you will have your expenses year one of retirement, and those expenses will increase with inflation over time. Now, if those expenses aren't increasing with inflation over time, but are actually declining on a real basis over time, what that means is you could potentially be able to spend even more than some of those studies look at that first year of retirement, knowing that that spending isn't a permanent increase. You're not spending more and then increasing that with inflation. You're maybe spending more, but then it's declining over time before backing back up at the end of retirement. So pretty simple study showing that inflation tends to be higher, but consumption tends to be lower over time, but some actual pretty profound implications of that when it comes to our own personal planning. So understanding this, understanding that of course you're not going to be exactly average, but understanding how the average retiree spends money and how those expenses inflate over time is crucial for our own planning, because we have that context and then we can relate that to our own personal situation to create the best possible outcome for ourselves. Thanks for watching. This is James Knoll with Root Financial Partners. If you found value in this video, please share it. We'll love as many people as possible to be able to hear this information. And please make sure too that you're liking this video and subscribing if you haven't done so already for more great content. If you want more resources on how you can create a better, more secure retirement, be sure to tune in to the Ready for Retirement podcast, where I release weekly episodes dedicated to showing you the tips and strategies that are most effective in creating the best possible retirement. And if you're interested in seeing how our services help retirees create a better plan, better outcomes, please be sure to visit our website at www.rootfinancialpartners.com.